A desert wind howled across the empty highway as Sarah checked her fuel gauge for the third time in 10 minutes. The needle sat dangerously close to empty, and the last gas station was over 60 miles behind her. She was driving through Nevada's most desolate stretch, where cell towers don't reach, and help can be hundreds of miles away. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Story 1. Sarah had been driving for 12 straight hours, trying to make it to her sister's wedding in California. The GPS had routed her through what it claimed was a shortcut, a 2-lane road that cut through the heart of the Mojave Desert. As darkness fell, she realized she hadn't seen another car in over 2 hours. That's when her engine started making a grinding noise. The temperature gauge shot into the red zone, and steam began pouring from under the hood. With no choice, Sarah pulled over on the shoulder of the empty highway. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic, no wind, just the ticking of her cooling engine. She grabbed her phone, hoping against hope for a signal. Nothing, not even one bar. Sarah popped the hood and immediately stepped back from the cloud of steam and antifreeze. She wasn't a mechanic, but she knew her car wasn't going anywhere tonight. As she stood there contemplating her options, she noticed something odd. In the distance, maybe half a mile up the road, she could see lights. Not headlights, stationary lights, like those of a building. Relief washed over her. Maybe it was a gas station or a diner, somewhere she could call for help. Sarah grabbed her purse and started walking. The desert night was cold, much colder than she'd expected. After 20 minutes of walking, the lights didn't seem any closer. After 40 minutes, they looked exactly the same distance away. But she kept walking because what else could she do? Then she heard the voices. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as she listened more carefully, she could make out distinct conversation. Multiple people talking, laughing even. The voices seemed to come from all around her. To her left, her right, sometimes directly behind her. She spun around, calling out, "Hello? Can someone help me?" But there was no one there, just empty desert stretching in every direction. The voices continued, sometimes clear enough that she could almost make out words, other times just murmurs carried on the wind. Sarah started walking faster, her heart pounding. The lights ahead still looked exactly the same distance away, no matter how long she walked. And now she was beginning to notice something else. Footprints in the sand beside the road, fresh footprints that seemed to pace her, always staying exactly parallel to her path. She stopped walking. The footprints stopped too. When she resumed walking, so did they. Sarah broke into a run, panic overtaking her rational mind. Behind her, she could hear laughter. Not friendly laughter, but something cold and mocking. The voices grew louder, coming from every direction now, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. She ran for what felt like hours, but when she finally stopped, gasping for breath, she looked back and could still see her broken-down car in the distance. She had somehow walked in a perfect circle. The voices were getting closer now. Sarah could see shapes moving in her peripheral vision. Tall, dark figures that vanished whenever she turned to look directly at them. The lights ahead flickered and went out completely. In the sudden darkness, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from every direction. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, and when the light came on, she screamed. Standing in a perfect circle around her were 7 figures. They looked almost human, but wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but she could see their eyes reflecting her phone's light, like an animal's. One of them spoke, and its voice sounded like grinding sand. "You walked our path, now you walk with us." Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was back at her car. The engine was running, the temperature gauge normal. Her phone showed 4 bars of signal. She drove straight through the night without stopping, reaching her sister's wedding the next morning. But Sarah never forgot that night, and sometimes on quiet evenings, she still hears those voices calling her name. inviting her back to walk their endless path through the desert darkness. Story 2. Mike Rodriguez was an experienced photographer who specialized in landscape shots of America's national parks. In March of 2019, he decided to capture some sunrise photos in Death Valley, one of the most remote and dangerous places in the continental United States. What he photographed that morning still keeps him awake at night. Mike arrived at his chosen spot, a rocky outcrop overlooking Badwater Basin, at 4 a.m., giving himself plenty of time to set up. Before dawn, he'd done his research, brought extra water, and told his girlfriend exactly where he'd be and when to expect him back. He thought he'd prepared for everything the desert could throw at him. As he set up his camera equipment, Mike noticed something unusual. In the pre-dawn darkness, he could see what looked like a campfire about a mile away down in the base. This struck him as odd. Camping wasn't allowed in that area, and anyone foolish enough to try it would need a permit and ranger approval. Through his telephoto lens, Mike could make out several figures sitting around the fire. They appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing, long coats, and wide-brimmed hats that looked like something from the 1800s. One of them seemed to be pointing directly at his position. Mike took a few photos of the group, more out of curiosity than anything else. He figured he'd report the illegal camping to park rangers later. For now, he focused on preparing for the sunrise shots. As the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the mountains, Mike looked through his camera again toward the campfire. The fire was still burning, but the figures were gone, all of them. Mike swept the telephoto lens across the entire area. No tents, no vehicles, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Puzzled, Mike checked the photos he'd taken earlier on his camera's LCD screen. In the first photo, he could clearly see 5 figures around the fire. In the second photo, taken just 30 seconds later, there were 6 figures. In the third photo, there were 7. But in the fourth and final photo he'd taken, all the figures were gone except one, and that one was no longer sitting by the fire. It was standing much closer to Mike's position, much closer. Mike's hands started shaking as he zoomed in on the figure in the photo. It was tall and impossibly thin, wearing a long black coat that seemed to flutter even though Mike remembered there being no wind that morning. But the worst part was its face. It didn't have where a face should have been. There was just smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank flesh, stretched over what might have been a skull. Mike looked up from his camera, toward where the figure had been standing in the photo. The sun was fully up now, providing perfect visibility across the basin. There was nothing there. He packed his equipment with trembling hands and started hiking back to his car. But as he walked, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every few minutes, he'd stop and turn around, but the desert behind him was always empty. When he reached his vehicle, Mike discovered that all 4 of his tires had been slashed. Long, precise cuts that looked like they'd been made with a very sharp blade. His spare tire had been slashed too. Mike was stranded, 40 miles from the nearest road, with no cell service and temperatures that would hit a lead 110 degrees by noon. He started walking toward the main road, carrying as much water as he could manage. After walking for 2 hours, Mike heard an engine behind him. A park ranger's SUV came over a rise, and Mike flagged it down frantically. The ranger, an older man named Tom, seemed surprised to see him. "Son, what are you doing out here on foot? Your car's back that way, running just fine." Mike insisted his car had been vandalized, but when they drove back to check, his vehicle was exactly as he'd left it. All 4 tires were intact, no damage anywhere. The engine started immediately. Ranger Tom gave Mike a strange look. "Desert plays tricks on people sometimes. Heat, isolation. Your mind starts seeing things that aren't there. Happens more often than you'd think." But Mike knew what he'd seen. He still had the photos on his camera to prove, except when he got home and downloaded them to his computer. The figures around the campfire weren't people at all. They were rocks, just oddly shaped rocks, that in the pre-dawn darkness had looked like human figures, all except for that last photo, the one with the faceless figure standing close to his position. That figure was still there in the image, clear as day, and if Mike looked carefully, which he tried not to do, he could see his own reflection in his camera lens, visible in the corner of the photo, and standing right behind him, close enough to touch his shoulder, was another faceless figure in a long black coat. Mike never went back to Death Valley. He sold all his camera equipment and took up painting instead. But sometimes, when he's working late at night in his studio, he sees a tall shadow pass by his window, a shadow wearing what looks like a long dark coat. Story 3. The final story comes from a highway patrol officer named Janet Mills, who worked the lonely stretches of interstate that crossed the Arizona desert. In her 15 years on the force, she'd seen everything: accidents, breakdowns, domestic disputes, and the occasional drunk driver. But what she encountered on Highway 19 in November of 2020 made her question everything she thought she knew about reality. It was just after midnight on a Tuesday when Janet received a call about a stranded motorist. A woman had called 911 from a rest stop, saying her husband had gone to check on a car that appeared to be broken down and hadn't returned. The woman was hysterical, claiming she could hear her husband screaming somewhere in the desert, but she couldn't find him. Janet arrived at the rest stop 20 minutes later. The woman, who identified herself as Carol Peterson, was pacing frantically beside a minivan with Ohio plates. She was in her 60s, clearly terrified, and kept pointing toward the dark desert beyond the rest stop's parking lot. "He just went to help," Carol kept repeating. "There was a car with its hazard lights on, just sitting out there," Frank said. "It looked like someone needed assistance. That was 2 hours ago, and I can still hear him screaming, but I can't find him anywhere." Janet looked where Carol was pointing. About 100 yards from the rest stop, she could indeed see the flashing hazard lights of a vehicle. It appeared to be an older sedan, dark-colored, sitting motionless in the desert scrub. "Ma'am, I need you to stay here while I go check on your husband and the other vehicle," Janet said, switching on her flashlight. "Lock yourself in your van and don't come out until I get back." Janet walked toward the stranded car, her hand resting on her service weapon out of habit. As she got closer, she could see that it was an old Buick, probably from the 1980s, covered in dust and sitting at an odd angle, as if it had run off the road and gotten stuck. The hazard lights continued their rhythmic flashing, but Janet couldn't hear any engine run. The car appeared to be empty. She called out, "Hello, this is the highway patrol. Is anyone here?" No response. Janet circled the vehicle, checking all the windows. The car was indeed empty, but what she saw inside made her stomach clench. The interior was covered in what looked like dried blood. Dark stains covered the seats, the dashboard, even the ceiling. The windows were tinted from the inside with the same dark substance. Janet immediately radioed for backup and a forensics team, but the nearest unit was over an hour away. She took photos of the scene with her phone and continued searching for Frank Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, can you hear me? This is the highway patrol." That's when she heard the screaming. It was coming from somewhere ahead of her, deeper in the desert. A man's voice, calling for help, the sound echoing off the rock formations scattered throughout the area. Janet followed the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The screaming led her to a wash, a dry creek bed that cut through the desert floor. She could hear Frank's voice clearly now, coming from down in the wash, but when she shined her light into the depression, she couldn't see anyone. "Mr. Peterson, where are you? Keep talking so I can find you." "Down here," came the reply, crystal clear. "I'm stuck. Something's got me." Janet climbed down into the wash, following the voice, but no matter which direction she went, Frank's voice always seemed to be coming from somewhere else. She spent 20 minutes climbing over rocks and searching through brush, but found no sign of him. Then the screaming stopped. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, not even the sound of her own footsteps seemed to carry in the thick air. Janet climbed out of the wash and looked back toward the rest. She could see Carol Peterson standing by her van, waving frantically and shouting something Janet couldn't make out. Janet jogged back toward the rest stop, but as she got closer, she realized Carol wasn't alone. There was a man standing next to her, a tall figure in dark clothes. For a moment, Janet felt relief. Maybe Frank had made it back on his own. But as she got closer, Janet could see that the man wasn't Frank Peterson. He was much taller, unnaturally thin, and there was something wrong with the way he moved. His limbs seemed to bend at angles that weren't quite right,
and when he turned toward Janet's approaching flashlight, she saw that his face was completely blank. No features at all, just smooth pale skin. Carol Peterson was gone. The figure stood motionless beside the empty minivan for several long seconds, then began walking toward Janet with that same unnatural gait. Janet drew her weapon and called out the standard warning, but the figure kept approaching. "Stop right there. This is the highway patrol." The thing that had been standing where Carol Peterson should have been opened its mouth, though Janet hadn't seen a mouth there seconds before, and spoke in Frank Peterson's voice. "Help me, I'm stuck. Something's got me." Janet fired 3 shots sent him. The figure stumbled backward, but didn't fall. Instead it let out a sound that wasn't quite human, something between a laugh and the noise wind makes when it blows through a canyon. Then it was gone, not running away, not falling down, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. Janet's backup arrived 40 minutes later. They found no trace of Frank or Carol Peterson. The minivan with Ohio plates was gone. The old Buick with the flashing hazard lights had vanished as well, leaving only tire tracks that led nowhere. They simply stopped in the middle of the desert, as if the car had been lifted into the air. The official report listed the Petersons as missing persons, but Janet knows what really happened that night. She knows because sometimes, when she's driving that stretch of Highway 9, she still sees that old Buick sitting in the desert with its hazard lights flashing. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, she can still hear Frank Peterson screaming for help somewhere out in the darkness, calling for someone to save him from something that can never be escaped. Janet requested a transfer the following month. She works traffic patrol in Tucson now, where the lights never go out, and people are never more than a few minutes away from help. But even in the city, on quiet nights when she's alone in her patrol car, she sometimes sees a tall, thin figure in her rearview mirror, walking along the roadside with that same unnatural gait. She never stops to investigate anymore. The desert keeps its secrets, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But if you ever find yourself driving through the remote stretches of America's southwestern deserts, and you see a car with flashing hazard lights, sitting alone in the darkness, keep driving. Don't stop to help. Don't even slow down, because what's waiting in that car isn't human. And once you've seen it, it will never stop following you. The desert has claimed enough victims already, and it's always hungry for more.